without further ado, I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Massimo Pigliucci, who's an author, blogger, podcaster, as well as the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York, with a Ph.D. in both Evolutionary Biology and Philosophy, which is an extremely interesting mix with a good backstory there. However, I do want to give a short anecdote. So when I was looking up Massimo on the internet, I was trying to, just see what his talks were like. I was bombarded with a plethora of choices: podcasts, writing, YouTube. He's everywhere. So it was a surprise to me. I guess it shouldn't have been when I spoke to a friend and found out that, oh yeah, my boyfriend, just mentioned him to me. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Wow. So I've talked to a lot of people, and Massimo is out there. And I think it's safe to say he is the foremost voice on modern Stoicism, among other accolades. Yes. So his academic work is on evolutionary biology, philosophy of science, the nature of pseudoscience, and practical philosophy. He's been published in national and international outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. His numerous books include How to be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, and Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk. His new book is The Quest for Character, the story of Socrates and Alcibiades teaches us about our search for good leaders. You can find him on YouTube. You can find him on Substack. He's got a great Substack, which I subscribe to, Figs in Winter. And you can also just go to his website, massimopigliucci.org, and you'll get a whole choice, a whole list of choices to introduce yourself to his work. All right. And I want to introduce Massimo. Massimo, one last thing. You do work with the Center for Inquiry, is that?
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely.
Also around skepticism.
Yeah, I write for Skeptical Inquirer every issue. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction, and thanks for having me here on a pretty nice Saturday afternoon. Actually, you could be doing other things, better things probably. All right. So let's see if we can get straight to the presentation. So the quest for character is actually, as you'll see in a minute, the title of my latest book, as Greg just pointed out, and it is about character. And I think that character is a thing that we don't talk too much about recently in society at large, and I think we should resume that conversation. And I wanted to convince you why that is an important thing to talk about. You can talk about it from different perspectives, and I'll present two of them tonight. One has to do with the way in which the ancient Greco-Romans approached character. That's because they had a lot to say about it, and I'll explain why. And the other one is modern science. I'm a scientist. I'm not just interested in ancient things for the sake of ancient things. I'm interested in ancient things if, in fact, they stand up to the scrutiny of modern science, if they're evidence-based, as they'll say today. So first of all, let's get one thing out of the way, because it's an obvious question and it's a fair question. Why the Greco-Romans? Why go back 2,000 years or 2.5 millennia to a specific place and time in order to learn something about character? Well, there is a number of reasons for it, I think. First of all, they were one of a number of cultures, together with Buddhists, Confucians, Taoists, and so forth, that actually got something fundamentally right about human nature. And character is about human nature. It's about who we are as a biological, social being. So if somebody gets stuff right, then it makes sense to use it, regardless of who they are, where they come from, and where they lived, when they lived. The second one is that what the Greek and Romans, as well as other cultures, have discovered about human character and human flourishing actually has withstood the test of time. I mean, modern psychology uses a lot of the same concepts, for instance, that the Greco-Romans introduced. The concept of eudaimonia, the life worth living, is now used in positive psychology, for instance. The entire discipline of cognitive behavioral therapy is originated in the 1950s directly from inspiration from the ancient Stoics. So these things do work, and they have withstood the scrutiny of modern science. And then the third reason is that we're talking about ethics, not science. If we were talking about science, let's say physics or biology, I would not suggest that you go back to Aristotle to learn some physics or biology. It's interesting to go back to Aristotle's physics and biology for historical purposes. And if you're interested in the history of ideas, of course, you would have to go back there because that's where it all started in the Western tradition. But you're not going to learn anything from Aristotle that actually would be taught in modern classes in physics or biology. On the other hand, if you went back to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you will learn a lot of stuff that it's still very relevant today in our discussions about ethics. And that's a major difference. And that's one more reason why the Greco-Romans are important. Although, as I said, I could do, well, not I, because I don't know enough about it, but somebody could do exactly the same kind of talk based on Buddhism or Taoism, and it would come out just about the same. In fact, there would be interesting similarities between those. All right, so this is the book. And of course, in whatever time we have this afternoon, speaking of which, how much time do we have?
Oh, yeah.
Sounds good. So in about 40 minutes or thereabout, obviously I cannot tell you about the entire book. It's 300 plus pages. So what I decided to do is to give you 5 take-home messages, five things that you can take out of, 5 insights that you can take out of the book, and hopefully we can discuss later in the Q&A. And for those of you who are coming to dinner, over a good glass of wine, or even a mediocre glass of wine, it's fine, as long as it's wine. So the insight number 1 is, if you're not virtuous, don't get into politics. Right, exactly. So what exactly does that mean? Let's start with these 2 characters that you see in this beautiful painting from the 1700s. The one on the right, yes, right, is Socrates, the one that has the little angel on his shoulders. The little angel is not actually an angel, is a daimon. Daimon is the Greek word from which demon came. But in the Christian tradition, of course, demons are bad things, right? You don't want to hang around demons. The Greeks were more neutral. A daimon could be a positive or a negative thing. It could be a good or a bad influence on you. And the daimon would always give you suggestions about what to do or what not to do. Basically, the daimon is your conscience. It's an externalized version of your conscience. And Socrates went around saying that he had his daimon telling him what to do and mostly what not to do. And in fact, when he was asked by his friends, it's like, what is the most frequent thing that your daimon tells you? His answer was no. As in, don't do it. The guy on the other side of the screen is Alcibiades. Alcibiades was a friend of Socrates. He was younger by 20 years. He was a friend of Socrates, a student of Socrates, and rumored to be a lover of Socrates, although apparently he wanted to be a lover of Socrates, and Socrates did not reciprocate. At least that's what Plato tells us in the Symposium. Now, Alcibiades is the kind of character that I don't understand why nobody's made a movie or a television or a streaming series out of the guy. So imagine the following. Alcibiades was impossibly handsome, uber rich, descending from one of the best families in Athens, brave, dashing. I mean, he had everything essentially. Well, almost everything, as we'll see in a minute. And he had a remarkably interesting life. He was involved in first person many of the major episodes of the Peloponnesian War, which was the major war that had just started at this point between Sparta and Athens. And that lasted for 20 years. He was a general. He became a general and then an admiral in the Athenian army first and the Athenian navy later. He escaped several times from prison. He was hunted down first by the Athenians for a betrayal for offending the Athenian gods, and then by the Spartans because he sought refuge in Sparta, and he was welcome there, but he also started courting the Spartan queen, and he got her pregnant, which is something that the Spartan king did not appreciate. So he left Sparta, went to Persia, which was the third major power in the Mediterranean at the time. And there too, initially things went very well. And then eventually he had to escape one more time. He made his way back to Athens. He was actually welcomed back to Athens, almost single-handedly overturned the situation in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians were badly losing at that point, and under his generalship were doing very well. Then he falls off again, falls off the wagon again. He finally gets hunted down simultaneously by the Spartans and the Persians, who we'll see in a minute end up killing him. So this whole thing happened over a period of 20 years. So you can imagine this would make a really good multi-series, multi-episode series. But this is very young. We're here now. Alcibiades is very young. He's in his early 20s. Socrates in his early 40s. And Alcibiades goes to Socrates and says, look, I think that given all the money and that I have and how handsome I am and my family and all that sort of stuff, I think I should be leading Athens in the war. I should become a statesman and a general. What do you think? And Socrates sits him down. The year is about 430 BCE. Socrates sits him down for essentially what we would today call a job interview. And so he says, all right, let's hear it. What would you do and why would you do it? Turns out, Alcibiades doesn't do very well during the interview. And the reason for that is because he suffers from the single worst problem that a Greek could suffer from, or in fact, any human being could suffer from: hubris. He thinks that he can do all sorts of stuff which he cannot actually do, and he's into it because of self-aggrandizement. He's not interested in actually making the life of the Athenians better. He's not interested in the glory of his country. He's interested in self-glory, and he's a narcissist. Yes, it sounds like a lot of people we know, actually. One in particular, I think I know who you're thinking about. So he's failing the exam. And at some point, Socrates says, alas, Alcibiades, what a condition you suffer from. I hesitate to name it, but it must be said. You are wedded to stupidity, best of men, of the most extreme sort, as the argument accuses you and you accuse yourself. So this is why you are leaping into the affairs of the city before you have been educated. Now, the word stupidity there, translated stupidity there, it's actually in the original Greek, amatia, A-M-A-T-H-I-A, which is better translated, if a little bit more clumsy, as unwisdom, lack of wisdom. So what Socrates is saying to Alcibiades is not that he's stupid in the sense that he doesn't get things. He's stupid in the sense that he lacks wisdom. He doesn't understand what the real priorities should be. He doesn't understand where the good is and where the bad is. And if you don't understand that, you better not become the leader of any nation. But of course, Alcibiades ignores Socrates' advice. He goes on anyway, becomes, as I said before, a statesman, a general, an admiral. He does very well and then very badly and then very well again and very badly, and he ends up that way. At the end of the day, in his 40s, he's hunted down by Spartan and Persian spies who surround his house. He realizes that. He comes out naked, as you can see, just with his sword and his shield in his hands, crying his battle cry, and people are so afraid of him still that nobody dares to engage him in personal combat. So they kill him from a distance with arrows and spears. And that's how you end up, at least in this story, if you are not wise, right? If you make wrong decisions in life. Now, so at least in that case, and we'll talk about other cases in a minute, not being virtuous really did not work out for Alcibiades. It worked out in the short run. He was always, about to do things and getting things, but in the long run, it kind of caught up with him. And we'll see several more examples of this in the rest of this talk. The second insight is virtue can, and in fact should, be taught. Now that lady over there is virtue personified. That's a picture that I took at in Pamukkale in Western Turkey, where there's this beautiful, it's a theater, yeah. It's a beautiful theater that has a number of statues representing wisdom, virtue, etc. But what is virtue? Well, let me give you some examples so that we can agree. Because when we use the term virtue, immediately what comes to mind is the Christian virtues, things like purity and chastity and stuff like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things like prudence, which is sometimes referred to as practical wisdom. This is defined usually as the knowledge of good and evil. So the knowledge of what is good and what is not good, what you should go after and what you should not go after. Justice, the notion that you should be treating other people as you would want to be treated, that should be fair and reciprocate to other people. So this is not a theory of justice as a sort of at a societal level. This is justice as a personal attitude toward other people. All the virtues are personal attitudes. Fortitude or courage, that's the ability to do what is right, even though it may cost you personally. And finally, temperance, the notion that you should be doing things in right measure, neither too much nor little. Notice that these are all character traits. These are all behavioral tendencies, as modern psychologists would call them. Right? So if you have a friend, for instance, these are just the so-called 4 cardinal virtues, the fundamental virtue, but there are a number of others. So if you have a friend who is, let's say, generous, what does it mean? It means that other things being equal, that person tends to behave in a certain way. She tends to spend money or time or resources on behalf of other people. Right? That's what makes her generous. Not always necessarily, but consistently, more or less. And that's what it means to have a virtue, to consistently behave in a certain way. Now, the word virtue comes from the, surprise, comes from the Latin virtus. But that is a translation from a Greek term. The Greek term there is arete, which actually means excellence, which explains the presence of that ominous-looking knife in there. So it turns out that excellence is not just moral excellence, it's not just an excellence of character. Excellence, the word arete, applies to everything. If you go out and buy a good bread knife, let's say, that's not a bread knife, but if you go out and buy a bread knife, the reason that came up to my mind is because I just did that a few days ago. What do you want? You want an excellent bread knife. And what is an excellent bread knife? It's a knife that cuts the bread nicely, without slipping, without making a mess and that sort of stuff, right? So you can tell that the knife is arete, has the virtue of excellence, because it carries out its proper function well, right? That is the function of a bread knife, to cut bread. It's not something else. It's not like playing music, right? If you complain to the store and say, hey, but this bread knife doesn't play music, the store clerk is going to look at you and say, what the hell are you talking about? That's not the function of a knife. So similarly, according to the Greco-Romans, human beings have proper functions. And if we carry out our proper functions well, then we are excellent. We are virtuous. And if we're not excellent. And in fact, we might be so bad as to be vicious, vice being the opposite of virtue. Now, what might the excellence of a human being consist of? What makes a human being excellent? You know, these days, especially colleges and universities, use the word excellent very easily, very unparsimoniously. So it's, oh, it's, you come here, you become excellent. Yeah, but excellent at what? Doing what? Excellence by itself doesn't exist. It's always excellence with respect to a particular function or to a particular kind of activity. So to understand what the Greco-Romans thought a human being excellence consists of, we have, once again, it's useful to go back to etymology and ask ourselves where these words come from. The word ethics comes from the Greek ethos, and ethos was translated by Marcus Tullius Cicero, arguably the most important Roman philosopher, as in Latin as moralis, which is, of course, where the term morality comes from. So ethics and morality are the same thing. Some people today want to make some kind of distinction between the two, but by and large, especially in this tradition, they essentially mean the same thing. And what do they mean? They mean the ability to live harmoniously with other people. And that ability is the result of a good character, right? So that's the idea, that if you are generous, courageous, temperate, et cetera, you will live well with other people. And the whole point of ethics or morality is to learn how to live well with other people. Why? Because we're a social species. We can survive individually, we can survive on a deserted island, but we're not going to thrive. We're not going to do well. The only way a human being does well, because we are biologically, fundamentally social organisms, is with other people. And therefore, that raises the issue of how do I live with other people? And the answer is ethically. So if you are good at this kind of thing, if you have a good character, you tend to live well and harmoniously with other people, then you are an excellent human being. And that is what we're talking about here, improving our character and making sure that our leaders have a good character, because that means we can live with other people harmoniously. Now, can we teach virtue? There's an interesting dialogue in the Socratic canon called the Protagoras. Protagoras was a sophist. The sophists usually were adversaries of Socrates. But in this particular case, it turns out that Socrates and Protagoras will agree at the end. The dialogue starts out with the two arguing about whether we can teach virtue or not. And Socrates initially is pretty skeptical. He says, I don't think so. And Protagoras says, well, why don't you think that virtue can be taught? And Socrates says, well, because I don't see good teachers of virtue out there. You would think that that's an important thing to do, but I don't see any teachers. Of course, his own students would have pointed to him and said, what do you mean? We got a teacher. But of course, he was modest, so he wasn't counting himself. And he said, I don't see. Not only that, he said, but I see a lot of people who are virtuous whose sons are not. And you would think that if anybody could teach virtue, it would be a father to his son. Of course, the women didn't count much in ancient Greece. So sorry, but that's the usual story. They started counting a little bit more in Roman times, but in Greece, with one big exception, Sparta. In Sparta, women were important and were educated. And the reason for that is because they were in charge of things at home when the men were at war, and the Spartans were always at war. So, somebody had to take care of things, and they had to do it properly. Okay, back to Protagoras. Protagoras says, well, hold on a second. Let's first ask ourselves what kind of thing virtue is. What kind of thing should we be teaching? And Protagoras suggests that virtue is like it's a techne, it's a skill. It's something like learning a musical instrument. So a flute, he actually uses the example of a flute. He says, if you want to learn a musical instrument, how do you do that? Well, you go about it with 3 elements. First, you probably want to know some of the theory behind playing of the musical instrument. If you don't know anything about the notes and how they relate to each other, you're probably not going to get a lot out of that flute. So a little bit of the theory. In the case of learning virtue, this would be essentially what I'm doing here, talking to you a little bit about the cardinal virtues, what they mean, why they're important. That is essentially the theory. The second thing you want, ideally, to learn how to play the flute is a good teacher. A teacher, of course, cannot learn the musical instrument for you, but what he can do is to point out that, for instance, you're not using the proper form, that you're making a mistake here or there, that you could be improving your technique in this way or that way. So a teacher is definitely helpful. But by far the most important thing in learning a musical instrument is practice, 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 practice. You start with the simple scales and you get more complicated scales. You start with simple tunes, you get to more complicated tunes. And even if you don't get to Carnegie Hall, it still is a matter of practice. Mostly it's about practice. Right? That practice can be improved a little bit by knowing the theory, and it can be improved a little bit by having a good teacher. But essentially, it's up to you. It's an internal thing. You have to do it on your own many, many times, every day, constantly repeating it. And that is exactly how you learn to become virtuous. Now, the question here is, okay, I understand how one could practice a musical instrument, or let's say learn a new language, it's the same idea. But how do I practice virtue? The theory, fine, I need to know something about the virtues and how they relate to each other. The teacher, yeah, sure, if you can find a Socrates, go ahead and find and get yourself one. But how do you practice? Well, let's say, for instance, that you want to be, that you realize a little, you do a little bit of self-scrutiny, and you realize that you could be more generous, that you need to work on your general. How do you work on your generosity? Well, there are a number of ways. One way might be to get into the habit of, in the morning, before you get out of the house, you pick some change, put in your pockets, then you get out and you give it to the first homeless person you meet. No questions asked. Now, initially, this will be likely, it will feel a little awkward. You will ask yourself, the hell am I doing here? Is that really the right thing to do? And, I feel weird doing it and all that. But if you insist, if you keep going, eventually it becomes habit. It becomes second nature. At some point, you just won't even think about it. You pick up a page and give it to somebody. That is how you practice not only virtue, but any kind of behavioral modification. Anything. When I studied years ago, for instance, I realized that, I should go to the gym on a regular basis, even though I hate it. Right? When I go to the gym and the nice lady behind the counter says, enjoy your workout, I was like, what? Who enjoys their workout? Turns out I do now. But only years later, right? So what happened was the same idea, that initially you make a mindful decision, say, this is really good for me, I need to do it. And even though it feels awkward and it feels like I don't want to do it, I really rather stay home and watch TV or read a book, I'm going to do it. Well, after you start doing it and you mindfully continue to do it, eventually it becomes second nature. In fact, eventually you're going to feel awkward if you don't do it. That is, in general, how you get into new habit, how you improve yourself. It's a combination of cognitive decision and behavioral modification, which is why the modern technique that derives from these kind of approach is called cognitive behavioral therapy. You make a cognitive decision, you implement behavioral modification, and then the two reinforce each other. Every time you see your behavior deviating, you go back and you reaffirm your cognitive decision and you redirect your behavior. That is a technique, that's an approach that goes back to ancient Greece 2,400 years ago, and to Socrates and Protagoras. Third insight that I would like to suggest is that a good character, I already mentioned in a sense, is an inside job. That is, nobody can become good for you. You have to do it yourself. Just like I said with the practice of music, nobody can learn music for you. They can help you learning music, but at the end of the day, you're the one that has to put the work. You're the one that has to make the decision to do it, and you're the one that has to do the practice. Now, in the book, a central section of the book has a number of chapters where I look at several examples from ancient history of what happens in two different cases. One, if somebody tries to teach ethics and virtue to people who are not particularly interested. And in the second group, what happens when people who actually are interested in self-improvement, in ethical self-improvement, themselves go out and try to get themselves a teacher. And you can imagine that the two situations are very different and the outcomes are very different. Now, you're going to see very briefly a number of examples. These are all from Greco-Roman history. And the reason for that is because, of course, you could write exactly the same book using contemporary examples. But if you use contemporary examples, as soon as you start picking on one particular example or another, you're very likely these days to lose half of your audience. So, oh, he picked on that because he's from the left, or he picked on that because he's from the right. And I don't want to lose my audience. I want everybody, if possible, to listen to these things. And I'm betting that you guys don't have as strong an opinion about Julius Caesar, let's say, or Cato the Younger, as you might have with regard to some modern contemporary politicians that should go unnamed. So here's the first group of examples. This is a partial list. These are all cases that didn't work out very well. Okay, these are cases of philosophers going out and trying to teach virtue to a leader, to a statesman, who was not particularly interested in learning. And the results were always disastrous. Probably the most famous one is Seneca, who tried to teach the Emperor Nero. Actually, to Seneca's credit, it worked out. It worked out for the first 5 years. He was doing okay, as it turns out. But then Nero became more and more unhinged, and things got out of control. In fact, Seneca lost his life at the end of the day because he was ordered to commit suicide by Nero. These other two examples are less known, the ones on the top, but they're kind of fascinating in my mind. They both concern Plato. Plato, to his credit, in his 60s and then again in his 70s, which for the time was an old man. I'm 59 now, so that doesn't feel like it. But at the time, this was, he was in old age. He got on a boat from Athens and he went to Syracuse in Sicily, which at the time wasn't as easy as it sounds, as it is today, and trying to teach, to implement his theories about moral virtue and about politics and moral and political philosophy to two of the tyrants of Syracuse, Dionysius I and Dionysius II. A tyrant, by the way, at the time didn't necessarily mean a bad guy. It just meant whoever was in charge. Somebody who was completely in charge of a city was referred to as a tyrant. But only later on, several of these people started behaving badly. It's only later on that the word became synonymous with, bad guy. At the time, it wasn't. Well, it turns out that in the first case, Dionysius I got so annoyed at Plato that he sold him into slavery. And Plato's friends had to put up some money to buy him back, basically, from the pirates to whom he was sold. So that was an adventure. Now, not happy with that, not having had enough, Plato went back 10 years later when Dionysius II was in charge, and he tried again. And we know this in part because he actually wrote a letter. It's called Plato's Seventh Letter, where he describes these voyages and these attempts in detail. And didn't go much better. I mean, this time at least it was not sold, but he was put at house arrest for a long time. And even though it was considered a guest of Dionysius II, in reality, it was that kind of guest that couldn't leave, no matter what. Eventually, it was rescued by one of his students. And that brings me to the second group of examples. That guy on the lower left, he was just, the tyrant was in charge. He could do anything. And so it's like, okay, you annoy me, so I'm going to keep you here until I'm done with the annoyance, that sort of stuff. The thing that actually worked was that Plato's third attempt. I mean, he was stubborn. He kept going at this thing. And that's the guy on the lower left, Dion of Syracuse. Dion was in fact a student of Plato. He was a willing student of Plato, not somebody that Plato just approached out of the blue. And Dion did become the guy in charge at Syracuse after Dionysius II. And sure enough, in this case, it did work. That period of history of Syracuse was actually pretty nice. People were well treated. Dion made a number of good decisions for the community. The other cases that you see here are similar. They're cases of either somebody who teaches himself virtue and then puts it into practice, or goes to a teacher from whom he wants to learn. So, for instance, there's Alexander the Great, who is being taught by Aristotle. That worked out pretty well. Aristotle influenced Alexander for many years. Alexander actually was going in his campaigns with under his pillow, he had a dagger, because you never know, and a annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, because he thought that book plus his teacher's annotations were by far more effective than any dagger at giving him advice on how to do things. The guy in the middle is Marcus Tullius Cicero, the same one that we just met, that translated ethics into morality. He was a Roman philosopher, but he was also a statesman. He achieved the highest political position in ancient Republican Rome, that of consul. And in fact, he was single-handedly responsible for saving the Roman Republic from the conspiracy of Catiline. Cato the Younger on the upper right was a Stoic senator who became an arch enemy of Julius Caesar because Caesar was considered by Cato a tyrant. And so Cato opposed Caesar in the Senate for 20 years. And then eventually, when Caesar took complete control of the Roman Republic, Cato picked up arms and started a revolution, essentially. Failed, but it did try to do the right thing. The guy on the bottom middle is Marcus Aurelius, one of the few emperor philosophers. And he had a really difficult reign during that period, the 2nd century, the latter part of the 2nd century. He had to deal with 2 frontier wars, people trying to come into the empire. He had to do with an internal rebellion from one of his lieutenants. He had to do with the Antonine Plague, which killed 3 million people in ancient Rome. It was the most lethal of ancient plagues. And he had to do with major earthquakes and at least one major flooding of the Tiber. Nevertheless, he did it pretty well. He did a very good job. He's considered one of the so-called 5 Roman emperors at this point. And his actions were always inspired directly from his understanding of philosophy, in particular Stoicism. If you read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, you see what I'm talking about, because that's his personal diary where he talks about his decision-making and how he tries to improve himself. And then finally, the last one over there is Julian, so-called the apostate. The apostate because he was the last Roman emperor who tried to turn the tide of Christianity back toward paganism. And so the Christians obviously referred to him as apostate after that. He was also a good emperor, and he was also a self-taught philosopher. In this case, instead of Stoicism, we're talking about Platonism. So these are all good examples. Again, why? Because these are people who actually wanted to become better. That's why the message of this section is it's an inside job. If somebody doesn't want to improve, they're not going to improve. Just like if somebody doesn't want to learn to play a piano, he's not going to play a piano. Or if somebody doesn't want to go to the gym, they're not going to go to the gym. You cannot force people to engage in self-improvement. It has to come from the inside. Number 4, we should all be philosophers. Note that word here is in scare quotes. Why? We should be like the philosopher on the left, Socrates, and not the one on the right. I don't know how many people here watched The Good Place, which was a really brilliant and very philosophically informed sitcom that aired for a few years until recently. Chidi, the guy here presenting the slide, was the resident philosopher, basically. So he's always giving talks to his friends about philosophy. But the problem with Chidi is that he's not a practical philosopher. He's all theory and no practice. And so over and over, he just keeps overthinking situations and never actually be able to act. It doesn't actually, he's not able to translate anything into action. If you want to have a sample of how good the show is and how interesting the points that the show manages to make are, you can go to YouTube and look for The Good Place Trolley Dilemma. And there is a nice little bit, it's 5 minutes long, where Chidi has to deal with the trolley dilemma. The trolley dilemma is this classical situation in philosophy where you're presented with an hypothetical scenario where you are on a trolley and there's this trolley that it's going, the brakes are not working, so it's about to kill 5 people, and you have the option of pulling a lever and diverting the trolley into a second track where it's going to kill only 1 person. Would you do it? Would you not do it? That's the kind of question. And then there are a number of variations on these themes, right? In fact, the whole thing has become a field of trolleyology where people come up with all sorts of variations. Now, the episode begins with Chidi explaining to his friends about the trolley dilemma in a theoretical way, right? He has a blackboard and all that sort of stuff. And one of his students is the character played by Ted Danson, who is actually a supernatural being. And he says, okay, let's try this in practice. So he snaps his fingers, and all of a sudden they all find themselves on an actual trolley that it's about to kill 5 people. And of course, Chidi freaks out and doesn't know what to do. And he kills the 5 people. And then he says, this is horrible. Chidi says, this is horrible. What have you done? We just kill people. And that dancing character says, no, this is not real. This is just a simulation. And Chidi says, well, thank God for that. It's like, well, but the pain is real. In other words, the characters are imaginary, but the pain is real. So there is real stakes there. And they do it several times. And every time Chidi gets it wrong because he tends to overthink things. So you don't want to be a philosopher like that. In other words, you don't want to be an academic philosopher. Chidi is the stereotypical academic philosopher who thinks about stuff in theory, but doesn't actually have a way to implement those thoughts in practice. It's a little bit of a caricature, but you get the point. How does a practical philosopher? So in ancient Greece and Rome, a philosopher, the word philosopher didn't refer only to a teacher. Surely, Plato was a philosopher, Socrates was a philosopher, no question about it. But the word philosopher actually referred to anybody who lives a philosophical life, who has decided to live a conscious, mindful life of ethical self-improvement. In that sense, anybody can be a philosopher. You don't have to have studied philosophy. You don't have to have a Ph.D. in philosophy. You just need to want it to be a better person. Specifically, for instance, to give you an example, if you wanted to be a philosopher in that sense, following the Stoic tradition, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, you would do the following. You would use the 4 cardinal virtues, the ones that I listed a few minutes ago, as kind of a moral compass. So anything you do, you ask yourself, well, is this prudent? Is it courageous? Is it just? And is it temperate? And if the answer is no to any of those, you're not going to do it. That's why the daimon that was advising Socrates often said, no, don't do it, right? Because a lot of things fall, a lot of situations fail one of those tests. So you could do that. You could strive for self-improvement by practicing a series of so-called spiritual exercises, the most famous of which is the philosophical journaling. The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius is an example of philosophical journaling. Basically, what you do is before you go to bed in the evening, you take 5 minutes, open up your laptop or, God forbid, actually an actual diary, and you start writing down about your day. And you ask yourself a couple of fundamental questions that I'll get actually in a little bit more detail at the end of this talk. But basically, it's an exercise in self-reflection. Trying to learn from your own mistakes and trying to learn from your own propensities. And then also, again, another way to be a practical philosopher in that sense is to apply what the Stoic philosopher Epictetus referred to as the fundamental rule of life. The fundamental rule of life says that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. And a good life consists in focusing your attention on the things that are up to you and developing an attitude of acceptance and equanimity toward the things that are not up to you. You may be familiar with this concept because it pops up in a number of other traditions, including 20th century Christianity. If you've ever heard of the Serenity Prayer, for instance, that's what it is about. Serenity Prayer asks God to give you the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change, what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot. That's essentially Epictetus' fundamental rule. And it's not by chance because Epictetus' Enchiridion, which means a handbook, Epictetus' Manual for a Good Life, was actually translated into Latin by Christian monks throughout the Middle Ages, and it was used as a textbook, essentially, for Christian practice. With only one minor modification. Every time that Epictetus refers to Socrates, the Christians change that to Jesus. But other than that, it's the exact same manual. Last but not least, what works and doesn't work when it comes to changing your character, to improving our character. And here I'm going to be presenting evidence from modern science, which again, actually goes pretty well with the teachings of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Let's start with what does not work. I'm going to give you a few examples of things that don't work. Don't do them if you're interested in ethical self-improvement. Surprise, surprise, doing nothing doesn't work. Now, why am I even mentioning this? Because you hear a lot, oh, you get older and you get wiser. No, you don't. You get crankier, not wiser. unless you're paying attention to what happens. You're paying attention to your own experiences, etc. But simply the passage of time doesn't make anybody more wise. So doing nothing does not help. Virtue labeling does not help. We're often told that we should tell, for instance, our kids that they're brilliant, that they're great, that they're here, that they're there. It's like, yeah, when they're not. It doesn't work. All it does is it raises expectations to levels that cannot actually be met, and it postpones inevitable failure. There is pretty good evidence at this point that this just doesn't work. It makes people feel good, both the parents and the kids, temporarily, but it doesn't actually address the underlying problem. The underlying problem is you got to work on things if you really want to be good. You're not just good by default. And when done to adults, it seems to me it's rather infantilizing. If you're telling an adult, oh, you're so good, when he or she clearly is not, you're essentially treating that adult as a kid. Nudging also doesn't work. Now, nudging is a very effective technique in certain contexts when you want to achieve behavioral manipulation of other people. The men in this room will probably be familiar, if you travel at all into airports, will be familiar, especially international airports, you will be familiar with a classic example of nudging. You go to a men's bathroom at the airport and you'll see in the urinal a little fly, image of a fly right in the middle of the urinal where you're supposed to be hitting. Why? Because men are pretty sloppy and they will do their things all over the place unless you gamify the whole issue, right? So it becomes a game. It's like, I gotta hit it. And at that point, things work pretty well. It's amazing, but it works. Now, it doesn't work, however, when it comes, nudging doesn't work when it comes to self-improvement because it's about manipulating somebody else, right? You're making, the whole point of nudging is making somebody else do something while they're not realizing that they're doing it. If we're talking about ethical self-improvement, you have to realize it. You have to, it's up to you. You have to make the decision. More other common examples of nudging that actually work, again, in terms of behavior manipulation, is a lot of companies these days, if they want you to enroll, let's say, in a pension plan or in a healthcare plan or something like that, they'll do it by default, so that you have to file paperwork in order to get out. It used to be that you had to file the paperwork to get in, and most people are just lazy; they just never get around to it. Right? So, if you prefer people to do it, you make that the default. Or organ donors, for instance, if you want people really to donate organs, you just make it default. It's not mandatory. You can get out of it, but now you have to file paperwork, and most people say, whatever. Right? They're doing it anyway. Now, here's what does work, and we're going to get to the end of this. Three things largely, and these were all things that, again, were clearly delineated by the Greco-Romans, and they work according to modern science. The first one is adopting a role model. That is, turns out there's very good evidence that if you ask yourself, when you're about to make a decision, especially a decision that is ethically or morally salient, if you ask yourself, what would my role model do? Chances are you're going to be far more likely to do the right thing or to act properly than if you don't ask yourself that simple question. That is why a lot of people in the South go around with this little thing that says WWJD. What would Jesus do? Right? Yeah, that's picking Jesus as your role model, and you ask yourself, literally ask yourself, what is it? And so, sure enough, one of the Stoic writers, Seneca, gives the same advice. He says, choose therefore a Cato. This is the same Cato that I showed you before, the arch enemy of Julius Caesar. Or if Cato seems too severe a model, choose some Laelius, a gentle spirit, who's a master whose life, conversation, and soul-expressing face have satisfied you. Picture him always to yourself as your protector or your pattern. For we must indeed have someone according to whom we may regulate our characters. You can never straighten that which is crooked unless you use a ruler. So the whole idea, I love this last phrase. The whole idea is that your role model is the straight one, and you're over here and you're trying to get straight. And if you know where your role model is, then you're more likely to become straight or to straighten yourself up. You can pick whatever role model you prefer. You can pick multiple role models. One of my favorite role models is my adoptive grandfather, with whom I grew up, and who was an extraordinary person. He seemed always to be doing the right thing, and he's always seemed to be a gentle, kind person. So whenever I ask myself, how should I behave in these particular situations? And well, what would Grandpa Tino do? And the answer is usually pretty clear. Like, oh yeah, not what I was thinking of doing. Number two, seek on purpose or avoid on purpose situations that test your character, depending on what it is that we're talking about. That is, you can test your character under situations where it is more or less safe, so that you can remind yourself that you do have a character, that you can make the right choice, even when you might be tempted not to do it. In other cases, you're probably better off simply avoiding the situation to begin with. There is, again, very good evidence from modern psychology that works. For instance, one of the trivial examples, which however does work, is, let's say that, I put on a few more pounds than I should have, and I like gelato. So how do I deal with this? Well, the next time that I go to the supermarket, I skip the aisle entirely. Because if I do what would be more natural for me, that is, well, I'll get some gelato, get it home, and then it's going to stay there. I'm only going to have it once in a while, only very little. That doesn't work, because that is a constant temptation. Now, literally 24 hours a day, every day, you're going to have the temptation to open the refrigerator and get the damn gelato. If, on the other hand, you make the decision once a week when you're going grocery shopping to avoid the aisle altogether, now the bar is much higher. If in the middle of the night you want gelato, now you got to get dressed and you got to get in the car and you got to get to the store. You're not going to do it. Right? So you put yourself in a situation where you can avoid the problem by thinking ahead. Epictetus gives some sound advice to his students and says, remember that you actually do have the resources to deal with situations. You may think that you don't, but you do. And he says, provoked by the sight of a handsome man or a beautiful woman, you will discover within you the contrary power of self-restraint. Faced with pain, you will discover the power of endurance. If you're insulted, you will discover patience. In time, you will grow to be confident that there is not a single impression that you will not have the moral means to tolerate. Right? So you can exercise your abilities, your virtues, one at a time, little by little, and at some point you will get confident enough that you can actually deal with all these things without budging. And finally, paying attention. Nothing has ever been improved by not paying attention. Now, there are many ways of paying attention to, in terms of ethical self-improvement. The one that Epictetus suggests here is the one that I mentioned before, keeping a philosophical journal. He says, admit not sleep into your tender eyelids until you have reckoned up each deed of the day. How have I erred? What done or left undone? So start, and so review your acts, and then for vile deeds chide yourself, for good be glad. There are different ways of doing this, and these are, as I said, again, it's a standard technique in cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the best ways to do it is to, before you go to bed, take 5 or 10 minutes, write in your own journal, and focus on one episode that happened during the day, where you perhaps could have done better, or maybe the situation was complicated, was difficult, or whatever it is. Let's say you had an argument with a colleague, or with your partner, or with your children, or whatever it is. And you can ask yourself those 3 questions. Seneca gives you a slightly different version of it, which works well for me. He asks himself, what did I do wrong? What did I do right? And what am I going to do the next time that something like that happens? Now, what did I do wrong is so, not that you can, beat yourself or anything, because that's useless. That's whatever you've done, it's done. But you want to learn from your mistakes. And so writing it down brings it back to your mind and says, oh, that is where I went wrong. This is where I actually made a mistake. You also want to pay attention to what you did right, not only because it's always good to pat yourself on the back if you deserve it, but because now you have established 2 points of reference. Wrong, right. So in time, what you want to do is to stay away as much as possible from this and to come as close as possible to this consistently, repeatedly. The third question is probably the most important one. What would I do if something like this happens again? I don't know about you, but most people seem to think that their lives are endless and interesting, at least if you look at their Facebook profile, that we always do different things and, life is so varied and all. Not really. We get up usually in the morning, we go to the same place, we see the same people, we do the same things, and then, come back at home and we do the same things and with the same people. And then during the weekend, we see the same friends and we do the same things, et cetera, et cetera. Our lives are far more predictable and repetitive than perhaps we would like them to be, which, however, it's an opportunity because it means that something that happened today, you got upset with your partner, it's probably going to happen again. Sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, it's going to happen again under similar circumstances. And the first time that has happened, you were not paying attention, so you reacted in a way that is not the best way. You got angry, you started shouting, whatever it is that happened. Now that you know, now that you've written down in your diary and says, okay, what am I going to do the next time? Now you're actually mentally ready. And there is very good evidence that if you're mentally prepared for a particular occurrence, you're going to handle it much better. Not necessarily perfectly, but you're going to handle it much better. The more you're prepared to something, the more you know that something is coming and you're already made up your mind about how to deal with it, the more likely you are to actually get through it pretty much unscathed. And that is pretty much what I wanted to tell you. Thanks very much. Time for Q&A?
Yes.
All right.
I'm a clerical error in that I attended Protestant seminary and did not become ordained or graduate. So I have a problem with canon and catechism, and I always say beware the priests and the false prophets.
Right.
So if you're looking for an example and you don't have Socrates who's passed, but you have someone who says, I understand Socrates, and let me tell you what Socrates means, how do you avoid being tempted into something that really doesn't fit your reality? And my dad, near the end of his life, became Baha'i, and with the sort of byword of truth from any path. I won't exclude the other paths because I will recognize something that rings true to me.
Right.
So how do we deal with that sort of representation?
Yeah, it's a common problem. Of course, we all fall for one thing or another that we shouldn't be falling for. I mean, the obvious answer there is just, well, exercise your critical thinking, but that's easier said than done. I think that in practical terms, the best thing to do is, first of all, always approach things from a skeptical perspective. And a skeptical perspective doesn't mean, unfortunately, the word skeptic these days just means somebody who doesn't believe anything, and that's not true. Again, the etymology helps. The skeptic means inquirer, somebody who does inquiry about things. And in ancient skepticism, the idea was that you don't buy anything 100%. You always assign probabilities, and those probabilities can change. You say, okay, that sounds good. Now let me take a look. Right. The other thing to do is always looking at multiple sources. Right. So just because I told you something, don't believe me necessarily. I mean, you can believe me provisionally. Say, okay, that sounds interesting. And if it sounds interesting enough that you actually want to act on it, then start doing some checking. Right. Then ask somebody else who's written about Stoicism, for instance. See if it tells you the same things or similar things. I mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. Look into cognitive behavioral therapy. Does it actually work? There is pretty good evidence that it works. Of course, that depends on how much time you have and you want to spend doing these kind of things. Right. Unfortunately, often the picking a guru is a shortcut. Like, oh, all I have to do is to believe whatever this guy says, and I'm done, right? I don't need to do my own research. I don't need to exercise any critical thinking. But that's on you, not you personally. That's on the person that makes that decision. I mentioned the 4 cardinal virtues of, again, prudence, courage, justice, and temperance. But those were not the only virtues that the Greco-Romans recognized. 2 more are very important, and they're not moral virtues. They're intellectual virtues. One is logical thinking, logic. They thought that we need to practice good thinking, not logic in the sense of, you know, formal logic, you know, syllogism and stuff like that. I mean, that helps, but mostly they thought we should actively practice good thinking. And that means a number of things, being aware of our own fallacies and cognitive biases and things like that, right? And the second intellectual virtue, they call him physis. Physis is the word for nature in Greek. So essentially science, as we would say today. To pay attention to the evidence. Don't do anything, in other words, that it doesn't either come with good arguments, logic, or that is evidence-based. Ideally, both. Now, again, we're all limited in terms of times. It's not like we can do our research for everything. At some point, you got to trust somebody. But if it is something important, if it is something you say, yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm want to start a program of ethical self-improvement. Well, then if it's that important, you might want to take some time to look around. You might want to take some time to do some research at some level and say, convince yourself that in fact, what I said tonight was pretty much what people that work in that area seem to agree. But there is no silver bullet. There's no obvious way to stay away from bad stuff other than just paying attention. One of the suggestions here was paying attention, right? Seneca has this nice bit in one of his letters to his friend Lucilius where he says, nothing has ever been improved by not paying attention. Imagine if you're the pilot of a ship and you don't pay attention. More likely than not, your ship is going to go down.
So,
Yes, possibly. Sorry. Yes.
yeah, so I guess one of the reputation, I think, for Stoicism is that it is very much cognitive and not necessarily friendly to emotion.
Right.
I wonder what your thoughts are about the role of emotion in virtue development.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had the same idea initially. When I got into Stoicism, the reason I got into Stoicism is in part because I was going through a sort of a midlife crisis, essentially. And I was looking for a new framework of some sort. And I had figured out by that time that the answer probably was going to come from what is referred to as virtue ethics. So that means Aristotle or Epicurus or people like that. So I started studying Aristotle and that's interesting, but doesn't really, doesn't click. And I went to Epicurus, so that's even more interesting, but it still doesn't click. So I was still looking around. And then of all places on Twitter, I see this thing that says, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because I thought, right, the Stoics, stiff upper lip, suppressing emotions, like living a life like Mr. Spock from Star Trek. It's like, no, that doesn't sound good. I mean, the fact that I actually love Spock as a character, but no, I don't want to live my life that way. Then I thought, hold on a second. Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics. So that falls into the general category that I'm interested in. Not only that, but I read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations when I was in college. That's Stoicism. And when I was in high school in Italy, I translated in Latin classes, I translated Seneca. I was like, well, okay, that's Stoicism too. So maybe these people are not quite that crazy. So I started getting into it. And it turns out that like many stereotypes, there is a foundation of truth to that notion of the stiff upper lip and the suppressor emotions, but it's only part of the story. And you had to really know the whole story. So the whole story briefly is this. The stiff upper lip kind of stereotype comes out of the fact that Stoics do teach that if you cannot do anything about a particular situation, it's not up to you, to use Epictetus' phrase, then you need to accept it. There's nothing else you can do. Throwing a tantrum and being upset on top of that, it just makes things worse. Because let's say, for instance, this silly example: go to the airport and your flight is canceled. Happens pretty much, right? Well, okay, now I have a number of options. The flight is being canceled. That's not up to me. There's nothing I can do about it. right? That's it. That's not my decision. But I can decide how to react. Now, do I want to start working myself up, getting upset, start yelling at the poor person behind the counter? I can do that. Release of emotion kind of stuff, right? But then you act like a jerk, first of all, right? You don't feel good because it's like, you really feel awful. And the poor person behind the counter, believe me, he would be just as happy to see you go on the plane than not, right? So it doesn't want to be there. So that doesn't help. So what does help? Say to yourself, okay, there's nothing I can do about here. So let me see if what's the next flight that I can book myself on. And after that, let me walk to the bar, have a drink and read a book, right? That translates into endurance of a situation, right? Acceptance and endurance, which is not the same as the stiff upper lip, but you can see where one might mistake one for the other. The thing with emotions is more interesting and more subtle. The Stoics did not try to suppress emotions, for one thing, because you can't. You can't do it. It just doesn't work. And Seneca knows that. He wrote a book called On Anger, where one of the first things that he does is says, you don't even think about suppressing anger because it's not going to work. But the Stoics made this interesting distinction between what they called healthy and unhealthy emotions. And they defined, they thought that healthy emotions are, as they put it, in agreement with reason. That is, those are reasonable emotions. Those are things that reason would say, yeah, go that way. And the unhealthy emotions are against reason. The basic idea is that emotions, contrary to what many people believe, actually are, at least in part, cognitive. There is a part of thinking going on there. And you can challenge that thinking in the case of an unhealthy emotion, or you can help that thinking along in the case of a healthy emotion. So what would be examples of it? Love for your partner or your children or your friends, those are healthy emotions. They are in agreement with reason. Why? Because reason would say, yeah, it's a good idea to have a good relationship, to take care of your children, to have friends, blah, blah, blah. Anger is against reason. It's unhealthy because it's against reason. Why? Because if you act on the basis of your anger, even if the anger is justified, more likely than not, you're going to regret it. You're going to do something that is over the top, or that is not appropriate to the situation, or there is an overreaction or something. What you need to do is to calm down first, allow yourself to calm down. And Seneca gives you a bunch of techniques, which interestingly are the very same techniques you can find on the website of the American Psychological Association under anger management. Very simple things, like you feel yourself getting angry, disengage from whatever situation it is as soon as possible. So things like, go out for a walk, go to the bathroom, excuse yourself to the bathroom, and then go there and start breathing for a few minutes, or count until 20, or do whatever it is that gets you out of the situation, because the emotion will subside. And then at that point, you can ask yourself, you can challenge your emotion, the cognitive underpinning of that emotion. Say, wait a minute, why the hell was I getting so angry here? What would be a better response to the situation rather than what I was going for? This is the same basis as cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, it's called cognitive behavioral therapy because the idea is that emotions, in fact, do have a cognitive component. And you can tell that to yourself because you can realize this if you start thinking for a minute. Let's say you're getting angry at a particular situation, and then however I stop you, you calm down for a minute, we'll go for a drink at the bar, and then I ask you, why were you getting angry? You will be able to tell me a story. In other words, there is a cognitive component. You may not have been able to think about that story in the moment when you were getting angry and were just feeling angry and that's it. But if I ask you later, you will be able to tell me a story. You say, well, I was getting angry because the guy insulted me, and being insulted is a bad thing, and I was embarrassed in front of my friends. There is a story there. And what the Stoics would say is, like, first of all, take the break and then challenge that story. Then ask yourself, why exactly was I embarrassed here? What is an insult other than somebody opening their mouth and moving air? An insult actually works only if I allow it to work. Right? Only if I react to that insult in the way in which the other guy wants me to react, that works. Otherwise, just words. And words don't hurt people unless you let them hurt yourself. So if you talk yourself through that way, it may seem from the outside like you're trying to suppress emotions. But what you're really trying to do is to talk to the cognitive component of your emotion. Epictetus has this wonderful passage in the handbook where he literally says, you should take an impression, which is your first reaction to things, and stop and look at it from a distance and say, you seem to be something, but maybe you're not what you seem to be. So let me see, let me figure it out. Let me take time to actually figure out whether in fact my initial response was the appropriate one or not. So, but you can see how that might lead to a misunderstanding of, oh, what the Stoics are trying to do is to suppress emotions. They're not trying to suppress emotion. Yeah.
One of the consistent arguments that my husband and I have had throughout our almost 44 years of marriage. wait a minute,
consistent.
Yes.
So it
It's
repeats,
consistent.
right?
But, and I'm right.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
And you're right. of
I'm
course.
right. I am right. If your theory that ethics is universal, that what was true and valid for the Greco-Romans is true and valid 100 years ago, 200 years today,
Yep.
then people like Thomas Jefferson were not moral people. They owned people. They did not treat people with justice. And I feel that all of our founding fathers were despicable. And what most people, including my husband, feel is that given the times, within the times, they behaved as good as they possibly could. And I basically have always had a real problem putting Jefferson, for example, because that's his favorite, on a
Sure.
pedestal and thinking that he was a decent man when I think he's a piece of garbage.
Right.
And I'm just curious, just from an ethical point of view, where you fall.
Yeah.
And I loved your
That's-
talk, by the way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I fall somewhere in between. And let me explain what I mean. Let's set aside ethics for a moment. I'll come back to it. Let's say we're talking about science instead of ethics. Science, we agree, makes progress. And we agree that science is universal, at least in this group, right? So in other words, it's not like your truth is my truth, is different from my truth. There is a truth. But we may not be able to discover that truth at any particular moment. You would never say something like, oh, Galileo was an idiot because he didn't realize there were other galaxies out there, right? You would simply say Galileo was doing the best that he could do at the time, given the instruments, given the understanding, et cetera, et cetera. Had he lived today, he obviously would recognize that there are galaxies out there, right? I think you can say something similar to that for ethics. That is, I do think that there's such a thing as ethical progress over time. It's not quite as lean, as neat as the progress of science. And it certainly, unfortunately, is open to reversals, at least locally. But there is progress. Like pretty much no society these days thinks that slavery is acceptable. Period. Pretty much every society 2000 years ago accepted slavery as natural. Not just the Greeks and the Romans. If you went to Egypt or China or India, it was the same thing. Mesoamerica is the same thing. Nowhere on the planet there was a civilization that did not have slaves. In fact, that did not use slaves as the major engine of economic growth, right? That to me is progress, right? No slavery. Slavery is acceptable everywhere, not acceptable anywhere, even though it may still be practiced occasionally, but it's not acceptable. On a shorter time scale, I think that it's undeniable that women, minorities, gays, lesbians, trans, et cetera, have made progress over the last 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, depending on which one you're talking about. So that to me, those are to me all instances of moral progress. That means that you cannot blame somebody who lived in a society where X, let's say slavery, was completely acceptable, was normally acceptable. That person should not be blamed for not being an exception to his society. It cannot be praised either, but you cannot reasonably blame that person. What you can do is, on the other hand, to to point your attention to those people that even then realize that there was something wrong with slavery and think those people are really above average. They were in advance of their time. Those are the people that I really need to use as role models. Those were ahead of the time. So, for instance, forget for a moment Jefferson. You and your husband will settle that one. But let's go back to the Greeks and the Romans 2,000 years ago. As I said, slavery was universal. However, and therefore I don't feel like, when people say, oh, but Marcus Aurelius had slaves. Yeah, of course, everybody did at the time. Well, everybody who could afford it did it at the times. That is not a cause of blame. To do so would be an example of presentism. That is the notion of projecting present moral standards into the past. Well, they were wrong. They just didn't realize that they were wrong. Just like yes, absolutely. But they didn't realize it. And so in other words, you want to treat them as ignorant, not as evil. Right? And morally ignorant. They didn't realize it. Most of them, some of them did. Seneca has this interesting letter to his friend Lucilius where he says, the person you call a slave, remember the person you call a slave is a human being just like you. It has the same wants and needs and pleasures and fears that you do, and therefore you should treat him accordingly. When I read that passage, I said, whoa, this guy was ahead of his time, 2,000 years ahead of his time, as it turns out. So I admire Seneca for that passage, but I don't blame anyone else at the time for having slaves, because that was or for not treating women, for instance, as equal, because at the time that was the situation. But they were in fact wrong. Just like if Galileo had said, no, there are no such a thing as galaxies, he would have been wrong. But you can't blame him for being wrong, because at the time, nobody knew about galaxies. Right? If somebody had actually written down and said, hey, you know what, there are galaxies out there, I would have said, whoa, that's impressive. So I tend to focus to treat that problem you're talking about in this way. Yes, people who did not implement the kind of moral standards that we think now are acceptable or should be implemented were obviously deficient in some sense. But if the entire society was deficient, then there is no point in blaming individuals and say, oh, you should have done this or that or the other. It's the entire society that it's problematic, but we got better. And so I rather focus my attention on those few individuals here and there who realized that there was something wrong and therefore try to teach others. For instance, at the same time, pretty much as Seneca, about a century earlier, Epicurus was one of the first ones who opened up his school to women. That was unheard of. Like, what? Women philosophizing? Are you kidding? But the Epicurus Garden, which was his school, was open to women. And because he explicitly said, women have the same abilities as men, and they ought to be learning the same kind of stuff that men know. So do I blame the entire Greco-Roman society for being misogynist or sexist from modern standards? That would make no sense. But do I praise Epicurus for being ahead of his time? Yes. Right. Okay. If you say immoral, it's obvious, an immediate, obvious negative judgment on that thing, right? How about you say it was not as morally sophisticated as we are, or morally advanced as we are? Because in that way, you are putting the emphasis on ignorance, right? It's like, okay, it was deficient in the sense that it was just as ignorant as everybody else, or most other people in his time and place. I think that makes it more constructive. It's a more constructive criticism than just say, oh yeah, the guy was awful. It wasn't awful. It was complicated. All right. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think I was the next person. So I guess my question is, one, do you think Stoicism is having sort of a popular, becoming more popular? And if so, why? And then my second very quick question is, what is the Stoics' view of religion and community? Because, here at Ethical Culture, we're trying very hard to continue to build a community, but we find it's difficult,
Yeah.
especially in today's world.
Yeah.
And I don't really get a concept of what a Stoic community looks like.
Yeah.
So those are my two.
Good questions. Is Stoicism getting more popular? Yes. Good. At this point, there's no question about it. I mean, if you did a search on Amazon or Google for Stoicism 20 years ago, you would find close to nothing. You would find mostly academic papers about Stoicism. Now you do the same search, you're flooded with books and podcasts and videos and stuff like that. Some of which are good, some of which are crap, and a lot of which are kind of in between. So yes, there's been press coverage, there's been conferences, there are lots of local groups, there are local stores, they're called. Talk about community, I'll get to that in a minute. So the answer is yes. Why it's more complicated? I don't know of anybody so far that has done a sociological thesis on this thing, but somebody should, and probably somebody will at some point. My sense is that there are a number of factors that contributed to this. Number one, Stoic ideas have always been valuable. Stoicism as a school did end in the 3rd century, more or less. But Stoic ideas kept influencing Christianity, for instance, and then early modern philosophy, all the way to Descartes and Spinoza and things like that. So in a sense, it's never been really gone away. There was the influence that Stoicism had in the 50s on cognitive behavioral therapy. That helped a lot because cognitive behavioral therapy has become one of the most evidence-based type of psychotherapy you can practice today. So that helps. It's also the fact that Stoicism appeared during the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period was the period between the death of Alexander the Great and the beginning of the Roman Empire. That was a period of major social and political turmoil where major things were happening, literally empires collapsing overnight and emerging almost overnight. And so people felt powerless. People felt like the whole thing was chaotic and, what the hell am I going to do? And how am I going to deal with this? That's typically when new philosophies arise. In fact, the same thing happened for Buddhism in in India, about a century before Stoicism. And the same happened with Confucianism in China at about the same time as Buddhism. Now, do we live in a period of turmoil, social and political? Hell yes, right? I mean, last century, we had 2 world wars, not 1, 2. We are looking at environmental collapse. We're looking at a regress of democracy across the world. We are looking at a pandemic that we just got kind of out of. So yeah, there are similar circumstances and sort of the interest. I mean, I have done a large number of requests for help from a Stoic perspective during the pandemic. I mean, like it shot up like 10 times as many as I normally get. The Marcus Aurelius Meditations was one of the best-selling books during the pandemic. So Marcus Aurelius Meditations. So there's that kind of reason. And then there is also the fact that somebody actually on purpose decided to sit down and make this thing happen. The first Stoicon, which is a gathering of people interested in Stoicism, happened about 10 years ago in London. And it was literally 8 people around the table sitting on chairs. And these were all cognitive behavioral therapists or philosophers who thought, hey, this comes with a bunch of techniques that are useful to people. Why don't we tell people about it? And so they started organizing Stoicon, which is, as I said, this yearly gathering of Stoics. And when we had one in New York, only a few years later, only like 40, I think the one in New York was only the 4th one. And we had 500 people showing up. Right. So it's clearly had, and of course, last and possibly least, social media. Right. It used to be that if you were interested in Stoicism more than any other philosophy, what the hell do you go? If you're interested in Christianity, you go to the local church. But if you're interested in Stoicism, what are you going to do? Well, now all you need to do is to get on a Facebook group or anything else like that, and you'll find immediately other people interested. To your second question, community. Well, one of the fundamental ideas of Stoicism is cosmopolitanism. The Stoics consider themselves citizens of the world, which is the literal meaning of cosmopolitan. We ought to treat other people, no matter where they live and who they are, as brothers, sisters, or these days, whatever other gender they choose. And so that's a fundamental idea of Stoicism. So it's the community part is inherent in the very idea of Stoicism. How do you implement it? With local stores. So there is a website called the Stoic Fellowship, which is its whole purpose is to help people create local communities. You go there, there's a nice little map of the world. You click where you are. And if there's already a store there, they'll put you in touch with the person or the people that were running it. And if not, they say, well, now you have two choices. You want to be on a mailing list just in case somebody starts something, or do you want to start something? And that's how it spread. Now, I think at the last count, there were something like 350 stores throughout the world, which is not a large number, but it's a decent number. It's a decent number. And the way they work is simply people gather together like this, and they have discussions. They help each other practice. They reinforce each other, commitment to trying to become better persons, more, ethical self-improvement, that sort of stuff. All right.
Great. Well, thank you, Massimo.
Absolutely.